Hi, this is Tom for Poker VIP, and this is the fourth and final part of my series on Pot Limit Omaha here at TonyBet. So, in the previous session, we talked about player profiles, the importance of researching a site for the purpose of rake, and keeping emotional control when variance occurs. And then, because I tempted fate, variance very much made an appearance and tested my emotional control. But it did illustrate an important point about the fact that we can still get our money in very good and have range advantage, even when losing, and that variance cares nothing for reputation and can occur to anyone. So in this fourth and final part, we're going to continue to play our tight aggressive style. You may recognize some of the players from the previous parts in the series. So there are some players we have a little bit of a read on. I am particularly happy I have position on Gibbon in this right-hand table, given that he is probably the best player at these stakes. So both of these tables are $25 tables, or €25 tables, apologies. And they seem like a good stake to round off. When our opponent tries to get it in versus our top two, we are just going to get it in. We are ahead of 10-8. We unfortunately lose to running runner flush. Again, a pretty good spot to get it in. An unfortunate result. You can run it twice here at TonyBet. Unfortunately, he decided not to exercise that option, and then apparently decided to chat some salt for reasons known to himself. But anyway, we will continue with our value heavy strategy. As evidenced, we can get it in very, very good, and long term, these results will most definitely be profitable in games such as these. I'm going to be folding 10s even versus the under the gun limp. It's just not going to flop well enough. Going to be folding the 10-9-7-4. It's just too weak of a hand. And so the right hand table is filled up reasonably quickly, which is, I guess, reasonably good news because both tables are now 6 max, and that is what is going to be the most common form of Pot Limit Omaha available online. So having very similar dynamics on the two tables should hopefully aid the educational process of these videos. The left-hand table, pair of threes, is not going to be sufficient. And again, at these stakes, as we saw in the previous part with the 50 table, we are seeing a lot of open limping, which we would expect from loose passive players. And when we see this kind of action, we can profile them as the type of player we should be value betting particularly hard. We just saw our opponent here get it in with bottom 2 pair on a flop, which is not necessarily the most profitable route in Omaha. In Omaha, 2 pair is a moderately strong hand, depending on board texture, of course. But in general, top 2 has so much more value than bottom 2 or even top and middle, just for strength reasons. And so in general, trying to get your entire stack in with bottom 2 pair is not going to be a winning proposition. Best case scenario, you are likely going to get it in versus an enormous combo draw, and the rest of the time you will be getting it in versus a hand that has you absolutely dominated. I'm going to be raising off my big blind here purely just to take the lead in the hand. And we're going to be continuing here with our top 2. We have a backdoor flush draw to go along with it as well. Turn is basically the worst card in the deck. There are 2 options we have here. We can either bet and try and rep 3 queens, 3 aces. I think unfortunately our opponent is not the kind of player who's ever going to fold a flush, ever fold queen 6, or ever actually just fold a 6 at all. So I think given I'm playing loose passive players and we're playing a value heavy strategy, we're just going to be playing reasonably honest and not turning hands such as this in buffs. Against some players it will work, against a nitty type player it might work, but overall it's not something I'm going to be doing. He's chased a weak flush, he has hit a weak flush. Mazel tov, my friend. Very questionable open. He called money off when he was behind, and he got 0 value when he made his hand. In general, that is not going to be a particularly profitable route. But it is his money. He can play it how he wants. Jack 9, 10, 6. This is a bit close if it gets folded around. If it had a suit to it, I would be raising it, no questions asked. I think when offsuited, it may actually just be a fold. Gibbon makes the decision for me by just opening in front of me. Makes the decision very, very easy for me. And double suited threes, pretty much giving a fold in just about any spot on the table. You could possibly make a case for them raising on the button against very nitty players in the big blind. It's probably about the only eventuality where you would want to consider raising. So it appears Gibbon is very much like myself, just going for a value-heavy line against this player. When he checks the queen, he's likely on a 2-pair type hand. He's just going to check through. He actually did not have 2-pair there, which is a bit surprising. When we have just junk, pretty easy fold, and move on to the next spot. And the offsuit ace we can also fold. So the important thing when we happen to lose a hand, much like the one that started off this session, is one, to evaluate how well we got it in, of course. And with sites that allow for hand history and HUDs, of course, we can go into our databases and start analyzing that, whether you have Poker Tracker or Hodl Manager or Jivaro, and just play around with range calculators and see how you're doing. But the second thing is to continue to play the same style that has been profitable for you and not make huge adjustments based on the fact that you're either up or down. And this applies to any form of poker, not just Omaha. But the nature of Omaha, by having 4 cards, means that it is relatively easy for you to start convincing yourself that any hand is playable and attempt to chase your losses back. And this is going to mean that you are almost certainly overplaying spots, playing either a loose aggressive, loose passive or maniac style, both of which can be exploited by people who are knowledgeable about Pot Limit Omaha, and they will adjust to your strategy if in that emotional state you could call it a strategy, and at that point will proceed to exacerbate the problem and fault you more than likely. So we're just going to be continuing with our strategy that served us very well in previous 3 sessions in terms of finding good spots and getting money in good, and really not be focused by the results. This series is a 4-part series of 30 minutes. I'm sure somebody could go back and count the exact number of hands that I play in this series, but as a sample size, it's going to be very noticeably small. When we flop top pair, a open-ender and a flush draw, we have nut outs to the queen jack. The flush draw is not nutted. So I'm going to play this moderately cautiously. I think if we raise, we're only really getting it in versus hands such as mine with the nut flush that are free rolling me, and top 2 and sets, which we are not favorites against. So I'm going to play this purely for the value of hitting the hand. If I hit a flush, there are 2 things I could do. I could either bet out to fold, or potentially check call depending on sizing. If I hit the straight, we can be very, very confident that our hand is good. Opponent bets twice, which is certainly an aggressive line and is more than likely indicating he has a made hand, something along the lines of King 10, 3 10s, 3 kings. We make a flush. Now we have the interesting spot. The fact it's the ace high flush actually means that our hand greatly increases in strength. We now have the second nuts versus what we would have had as the third nuts. So we are going to bet for value here against 3 kings. The fact it's the ace that comes off, though, does mean that a good number of straights here, which means that our opponent potentially is a little more reticent to call. So our opponent is going into the tank and decides to fold. That seems pretty reasonable, to be honest. He's probably a little surprised that we bet on the ace of spades, given that most of our flush draws will be nut flush draws. That being said, I can have a hand such as the one I had very easily, and I can also have hands such as something like a king with the second nut flush. We're going to open our double suited kings that has top pair and the second nut draw, and when the ace comes off, realizes it has the nuts and suddenly gets excited about it. That being said, I think the times we check, our opponent is going to check all his range through, and as such, we cannot allow him to do that. We have to force the decision onto him. When we have a loose passive player 3-betting us, we've seen him open limp a lot in the previous session. We're going to be defending for sure, but the option of 4-betting doesn't seem like an appealing one. We're going to be betting 2-pair and a flush draw here. And our opponent pots. This is a bad bet, and the reason for it is one of two reasons. Either our opponent is good. He is repping aces. Either our opponent aces are good, in which case he wants to extract value from it. And a pot-sized bet is going to scare out just about all of my range. If my opponent is bluffing, which is significantly less likely, he is bluffing with a sizing that he doesn't need to do. He can fire $3, he can fire $3.50, and have exactly the same result as a $5.50 bet. As such, he is going to be risking an extra $2 for negligible returns. So a pot-sized bet on what is quite a dry board in a spot where my calling range likely does not hit this is a leak. That being said, I do fold kings. It would be the equivalent of somebody 3-betting kings in Hold'em and potting every single type of flop. It's unnecessary. It will be effective in certain spots, but it will cost you more money in others. And just because the game is of a pot limit variety doesn't mean that we have to fire pot every time. If you've watched the previous 3 and indeed the first 10 minutes of this video, you will see that I have used different sizings. I'm mixing it up. I'm calling sizings that I think are either going to extract maximum value against my opponent's cap range, or I'm betting a sizing that I think is going to be effective in terms of bluffing while not risking any more than I actually need to. So pot betting has its place for sure, but it should not be a default for us. The more people in the pot, the more we are likely to size up. But in a heads-up spot like that, it really doesn't make any sense. So I have a reasonably large pot on the left-hand table. And Gibbon has decided to put the opponent in on the river on a paired board. The 8 does complete the 5-6, but in all probability his value range is fairly full house heavy. As for a bluff, there really isn't much that makes sense as a bluff there. So it's almost certainly an exploitative line that he's taking just to try and get maximum value off his opponent. Deuces, we're going to be folding. Jacks. I mean, truthfully, when off-suited, they're not stunning. I do think the fact they make straights is to their advantage. And we do have a nut flush blocker. So we are going to defend. We're not thrilled by this. The flop is actually a spot that typically hits my range more than my opponent's. That being said, I am playing in a series of games where opponents are not overly keen to fold. And indeed, some opponents are not overly keen to understand ranges. That being said, I think Eat Sleep PLO is one of the better ones in this game. When he checks turn, he caps range. He can have turned some 8-9s potentially. He can have some hands such as 8-7, which now make a straight. I don't see a point in turning jacks into a bluff, truthfully. I have showdown. I don't see 2-pair folding that frequently. I end up making a top set, but I really have the same issue as previous, in that I don't think my opponent either has air by checking or 2 streets, or he's checking a moderately strong hand such as 8-7, which I think is less likely. So I'm going to be checking and using this as a bluff catcher. It also establishes that I can have a strong check calling range, which is going to mean that some later hands that I check through can take showdown in spots they wouldn't do otherwise. So it achieves two goals there. One, I'm minimizing my risk in a spot where it's pretty difficult for me to extract value, truthfully. And secondly, I'm establishing a more balanced river check strategy. And as such, my opponents can't bet their entire range every time I check. I would have been fairly stunned if 3-jacks was not the best hand there, but I would also have been fairly stunned if I called and got value. Sorry, if I bet and got value. The ace queen 6-5 is not connected enough. It's essentially two hold'em hands stitched together. That is pretty much the only hand flop I would have enjoyed seeing. Such is the way of life. Kings of the connected variety, for sure going to be 3-bet. Or just open raised. We have seen Eat Sleep Pillow merely call with kings pre-flop to a 3-bet. So if he 3-bets, it would have made life somewhat awkward. If so is Poker had 3-bet with their stack size, I would just be rolling with them. My aces are of the off-suited variety. That being said, I am trying to isolate and take this pot heads up as best as possible. And we're going to isolate the limp with a fairly playable hand. Garrick overcalling with that stack size is flat out awful. He's put about 30% of his stack in a spot where he does not have range advantage. I'm going to be calling here. My hand flops well enough to justify it. When Xena pots here, it's basically saying he has 3 kings, and I have no reason to not believe him. So in this spot with just top pair, it's not fantastic. That being said, I am getting 5-1, so let's attempt to redraw on someone. Redraw complete. Ladies and gentlemen, I can win an all-in. Miracles do occur in training videos when I am playing the smaller table. Double suited kings. Likewise, pretty easy 3-bet. There is an argument on the left-hand table for merely calling the aces, and it's certainly something I would have considered doing. But I think against players that are fairly passive, 3-betting and just taking the initiative is going to mean I'm going to be able to just c-bet and take the pot down a very high percentage of the time. And when a passive player such as that leads pot into 2 people, one of whom is putting a large chunk of his stack in pre-flop, we just have to assume that aces are never good there. We're going to be raising the limp. Again, I want to have lead, I have position, I have range advantage. I have quite a good hand as well. There's an argument for checking back here, but I'm trying to extract maximum value off flush draws. So I'm going to go kind of small. I'm going to get a deuce raising me anyway, but attempt to get a flush draw to station and potentially hit and get itself in trouble. Sadly, that doesn't occur. 4s, pretty easy fold. Interesting river raise here. Pretty much repping the 7-5 hard and not much else. Don Corleone has put enough of his stack in. He may be forced to call off pretty wide here. And to the surprise of no one, he shows up with the 7-5 for the nut straight. Going to be raising on the button with a moderately playable hand. It's not a hand I would be playing in other positions, but on the button we are going to be loosening it up considerably. We do have a second up flush draw. Getting 3-bets not fantastic. That being said, in position I will be defending. We're going to be defending pretty wide range. If my hand was theoretically ace 10-8 deuce, it's slightly less attractive just because my opponent is going to be so ace dominant, or aces dominant in this 3-betting spot. With an ace high flop, when we totally miss, we're just going to fold. That hand is towards the bottom of our calling range, could potentially be a fold, but I think when we have position, we can call. When we're out of position, we're just going to be folding that quite happily. The 10s are going to get opened. If Xena calls, then I think we merely overcall. We have a strong hand, but not so strong that we want to start playing 3-bet and 4-bet spots and greatly reducing the stack to pot ratio. Gary 3-bets, which makes things really awkward, in fact. We did see them overcall a chunk of their stack. We have a fairly good hand in this spot. I think, to be honest, calling for this percentage of stack is a mistake. We're just going to have to fold every time we miss. And I feel folding against a 3-bet here is probably a mistake, so I think we just get it in with our 40% and just rumble with it. The fact they haven't snap called is laughably terrible. There is literally no hand they should ever fold here. Okay. We lose the first one. I can probably tell how this is going. Yep. If he's 3-betting that hand, he literally has to call off every single time. I really don't know why he even thought about it. Again, the Queen Jack 10-10 is not something I'm going to get in for 100 big blinds for sure. But against a player playing 25 big blinds, 20 big blinds, it's doing more than good enough versus his range. Obviously, we then have to win the flip, which the last 2 sessions have very much proved we're not fantastic at. But as a play based on the equity we have versus his range, then we just have to get it in. The only hand we really don't want to see is something along the lines of aces or kings with a 10. And that's pretty much the only part of his range we don't have the equity versus. And given we have 2 of the 10s ourselves, that's such a small part of the range versus the wide variety of hands he's going to try and get stacks in with, that overall we're just getting the correct price to get our money in. The offsuited ace we are going to be folding. And the ace king 8-4 certainly looks better than it actually is. However, we are in the big blind, we've already made a contribution, and the hand has the potential to make the nuts. I think if Xena had limped, we just continue with our strategy of ISOing him. If he raises, we just call. Just take flop, we have position, we have a pretty strong hand, given what we consider most players to raise in the small blind, and most players in Pot Limit Omaha raise their small blind too frequently. Just going to be defending the double-suited 10s here. Whereas in Hold'em, our objective is to really be aggressive in the small blind. In Omaha, against opponents that are incentivized to call, we are going to be overplaying too much of our range and just going to be putting too much money in with garbage that doesn't play particularly well post-flop and just be losing hands post-flop far too readily. I'm going to be just defending my kings here. In actuality, we do sometimes run into ace-king and king-queen, and we want to protect against that. And we want to give him opportunities to bluff if that is what he is doing. We upgrade to the nut full. He checks back, which is somewhat disappointing. He sometimes checks a king back, although I would be fairly stunned if he'd done that. I think we just have to go for value. I think once he checks turn, he's very unlikely to be suddenly betting river. The fact he bet into 2 people was a sign of strength, but he did half pot it. I guess he was playing a one and done strategy with something along the lines of aces or queens. The sizing we bet on the river, there is absolutely no way he is ever folding a king. So I think he has a perfect showdown hand with something like aces or queens, which we can try and get value off, and we will some of the time. But he's going to check through just about every time. So the only way we can actually extract value is by betting, even though we're unlikely to be called. It is the more likely route to get money into the pot. Very nice hand here, pre-flop. Very disappointing flop. Our opponent, who is short stack pots on a board that typically is going to hit calling range and is certainly not helping ours. Going to be ISOing kings. We get an overcall. This may well be going forward. So we flop second set, and we can be pretty confident that no one has three aces here. So we have, in effect, the nuts. There are enough draws out there that we want to be betting. We want to be betting versus flush draws. We obviously block the nut flush draw, but we've shown that loose passive players can chase flush draws. We want to be betting against queen jack 10, and we want to be trying to get money in versus ace king, ace 4, 3 4s. And just trying to get someone to make a mistake and overplay. The problem is our hand looks very nutted when we bet into three people, but the board is scary enough that we do not want to check through and have a turn card come off. I think there are just too many turns that we're not going to enjoy the sight of. I don't expect to get an enormous amount of action. I think the best case scenario is someone that calls with a flush draw or with the queen jack 10 draw, which unfortunately didn't even happen. But it is reasonably likely that one of the three would have had a hand like that. So I'm going to be playing versus drawing ranges. I'm going to know how to react accordingly on turns. I can slow down. I have position versus my opponents. I can slow down on clubs, and I can sometimes slow down on broadways. But we're trying to extract value off those kinds of hands. As I said, unfortunately, our opponents didn't have that range at that point. But it is still for sure the better play than checking. In general, checking in Pot Limit Omaha is to invite disaster. There's just too many bad turn cards. The one exception I would say to that is if you're playing a complete lunatic who is massively overplaying his range, as we touched on with Maniacs in the previous part, in which case there are going to be certain instances where calling and knowing that our opponent will bet every single river can be profitable. And we just have to sort of take it on the chin if they hit a gut shot, hit their open ender. But know that that play long term is going to realize there's more equity than raising, where they can fold their medium and mediocre hands. But in general, against players who are loose passive, that we're trying to play a very value heavy strategy against, then we are going to just be fast playing just about all of our value hands and attempting to make them make the difficult decisions. Which is some of the best advice I ever got given in poker, was to make other people make the bad decisions. And that applies to any form of poker, not just Omaha. But in general, if we're the ones forcing our opponents to make the bad decisions rather than, or the difficult decisions, rather than ourselves making the difficult decisions, then we are going to have a better time of it. I think another piece of advice that I got given, which again applies to all forms of poker, but can certainly apply to Pot Limit Omaha, is that if you are halfway through a hand, or if you're reviewing a hand, to be able to effectively say pause during the hand and then answer the question as to whether you're betting for value or as a bluff. Now, there are going to be instances where you are betting as a bluff and it happens to be a value bet because you get called worse. And there are going to be instances where you value bet and unfortunately your opponent has a better hand. However, in general, we should be able to tell, is our hand a bet for value or is our hand a bet as a bluff? And if we can't honestly answer that question, then we've done something wrong at some point in the hand. So I'm going to sit out the next big blind on both of these tables. We're coming up to the half an hour point of this final part of my series on Omaha. So hopefully we get a couple more interesting spots on the last orbit on both of these tables. We're going to fold fives when we are, even on the button, when it's limped, it doesn't really change much because we weren't playing the hand. Again, limping under the gun is weak. Again, given one of the stronger players at this limit is ISOing, I would expect nothing less. I'm opening the King Jack 10 deuce. I'm not folding if Don Corleone decides to get it in. For that limited stack, we're going to be doing moderately well versus his range, and he's not going to be 3-betting enough of the time to have me worried. Based on everything I've seen, he's very passive. So I'm just going to look to exploit that. So that's the final hand on the right-hand table. On the left-hand table, we do have a couple more. Kings. That would fall into the category of playable. When folded around, we're obviously going to open. We get a call. We get a iffy flop, truthfully. There are going to be two ways to play this. We could check and attempt to take showdown, or I can bet my equity and fold to a raise. And I think against a passive player, that's what I'm going to be doing. We can win with a 10. We have backdoor spades. In all probability, our king is good. If we get raised, we can very much put our opponent on the nutted value part of his range and find a fold. But I think by checking, we're inviting our opponent to potentially bluff us for 2 streets. Even a passive player is capable of that. And so I want to constantly be posing the question, and by betting, I keep my range as wide as possible. And thus, it makes my opponent's decision more difficult against a wider range. If I cap my range, if I polarize my range, if I tighten my range, it just makes my opponent's decisions that he can make with more information on his part, and decisions that have more information are going to be, in general, better decisions. And that's very much not what we want. We want our opponents to be making the worst possible decisions versus us, possibly. Gibbon is continuing his strategy of mercilessly raising Dodantic, or betting versus him. Dodantic's min raise is screaming strength. The fact it gets called should have him very much concerned. His pot bet is, again, fairly terrible. He is either crushing Gibbon, in which case betting pot pretty much screams that he is, or if he's bluffing, which I don't think he ever is there, he's bluffing too much. And if he has the nut hand, he just bet smaller and extract the value. Anyway, that is the last hand of this session, and indeed this part, and indeed this series. We've had 3 profitable videos. The third video was not profitable, but we got our money in very good in very many spots, and range-wise, we were crushing. I think over the 4 videos, we've showed how to play a tight, aggressive Pot Limit Omaha style, how to profile our opponents, and overall how to be profitable at these stakes, and indeed at PLO 50. If you have any questions, any feedback, or any general comments, then by all means leave them below and I will respond to them when I see them. And with that being said, I have been Tom, and this has been the series on Pot Limit Omaha here at TonyBet. And with that, I will leave you.